The Hillside house looked normal at sunset. 2 cars in the driveway, lights on inside, curtains half drawn. Then midnight passes, and the front door is found standing open, porch light off, no voices, no movement. By morning, every room is intact. Clothes in closets, dishes in the sink, keys on the table. But 4 people are gone. No broken windows, no forced entry, no signs of a struggle. Days turn into weeks. The search spreads through streets and woods, and nothing appears. Then investigators open a drawer in Sarah's bedroom and pull out a small leather diary, flipping pages that stop without warning. The night the Hillside family disappeared started like any other, the kind of evening where the shadows stretch longer as the sun dips behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. Yet, beneath the tranquil beauty of the night, something was stirring, something unsettling. A family, seemingly perfect in every way, vanished without a trace. And what followed was a mystery that would haunt the community for decades. This was no ordinary disappearance. It was a tragedy so peculiar, so elusive, that it would gnaw at the hearts of those left behind, echoing through their lives with questions that would never find answers. It wasn't supposed to be a night that anyone would remember, not in such a profound way. Claire, Stephen, Sarah, and Jamie Hillside had just settled into their home after a regular evening of family dinners and routine. The house was quiet now, save for the hum of a ceiling fan and the occasional creak of the floorboards. The Hillside family home, nestled on the edge of a small town, had always been a haven of safety, a place where the mundane rituals of suburban life unfolded. A loving mother, a hard-working father, 2 children whose lives seemed filled with potential. This family represented the quiet ideal of small-town America, untouched by the chaos of the world outside. Or so it seemed. That night, Claire had tucked Sarah and Jamie into bed, kissed them goodnight, and turned off the lights. Stephen, her husband, had sat in his favorite armchair, reading a book on the history of the region. It was an ordinary evening, uneventful by every measure. But somewhere just beneath the surface, tension was building in ways a family could not yet understand. There was something hanging in the air, a disquieting presence, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. Around midnight, the first oddity occurred. A neighbor, just across the street, glanced out of his window and saw the Hillside family's front door standing wide open. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe someone had forgotten to lock it, or maybe it was just the wind. But something stopped him from turning away. The porch light, usually left on as a soft beacon of warmth, had gone dark. The house, normally so alive with sound, was eerily still. No laughter from Sarah, no hum of a television, nothing. In the early hours of the morning, a few more neighbors noticed something strange. A faint sound, a car engine idling, far too late for anyone to be leaving. A low, steady hum that seemed to rise from the shadows. It wasn't the usual sound of a passing vehicle. No headlights, no tires crunching over gravel. Just a lingering sense that something wasn't quite right. By dawn, the unease in the air became undeniable. The local sheriff's office received the first call from a concerned neighbor, who reported that the Hillside family was missing. The house was unlocked, their cars were parked in the driveway, and there was no sign of life inside. The children's rooms were empty, the beds untouched. Their shoes, neatly placed by the door, were gone. No sign of struggle, no sign of forced entry. But something was wrong. The house, quiet and cold, felt abandoned. As law enforcement arrived, they quickly discovered that the family's disappearance wasn't just an ordinary case. There were no traces of violence, no ransom notes, no evidence of a break-in or any kind of forced entry. The family's belongings were still in place. Clothes hung in closets, books lined the shelves, and the kitchen was untouched, save for a few dirty dishes in the sink. The serenity of the scene contrasted sharply with the unsettling silence. It didn't make sense. They weren't just missing, they had vanished. The search began immediately, with local authorities combing the town and surrounding woods, expanding the search radius as hours turned into days. The sense of panic in the community was palpable. The Hillsides were well known and liked, especially Sarah, who was a popular figure at her school, known for her charm and bright smile. Claire and Stephen were active in local charity events, and their sudden disappearance left a vacuum of confusion and fear. How could a family just vanish like that? What kind of world did they live in where something like this could happen without a trace? In the days that followed, the town was shaken to its core. The family's sudden disappearance was a talk of every conversation, filling the empty spaces between mundane exchanges with a growing sense of dread. Law enforcement scoured the surrounding area, investigating every possible lead. Every missing person report, every unmarked vehicle, every whispered rumor. But nothing came up. The family's friends and neighbors were questioned, their movements and behavior scrutinized, but no one had seen anything unusual. There were no secrets, no hidden affairs, no dark pasts. The Hillsides had always been a fixture of the community, a stable, unassuming presence in a small town that rarely experienced such tragedies. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation faltered. The police came up with no answers, only a growing pile of questions. How could a family simply vanish, with no explanation, no clues left behind? What did they know that no one else did? In the face of this mystery, the town's curiosity shifted from concern to suspicion. Rumors started to swirl. Theories began to form. Was it an elaborate escape? Was there someone involved? Someone who had knowledge of the family's darkest secrets? Or was it something more sinister? An event so traumatic that no one could fathom the depths of what had truly happened? The truth remained stubbornly out of reach. No bodies were found. No definitive evidence pointed to any one direction. The case grew colder, but the questions continued to gnaw at the community, at the police, at the people who had known the Hillsides best. Then, almost by accident, something surfaced, a small, nearly forgotten detail that had been overlooked by the authorities during their initial investigation. Buried in the chaos of the disappearance, amidst a flurry of media reports and police statements, a small but significant piece of the puzzle was discovered. A diary. Sarah's diary. It had been tucked away in the back of a drawer, hidden beneath old papers and forgotten mementos, overlooked during the initial search of the home. A small leather-bound book, worn at the edges, with pages that had yellowed over time. The diary was handed to the investigators by a family member who had stumbled upon it by chance, thinking it was just a relic of Sarah's adolescence. But as they flipped through the pages, the truth began to unfold, slowly, almost reluctantly, like a story begging to be heard. The diary didn't just hold the secrets of a teenage girl. It held the answers to the mystery that had consumed the town for so long. It was the key to understanding not just what happened that night, but why it had happened. The first few pages were simple, innocent entries about school, friends, and her day-to-day life. But as the diary progressed, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more introspective, filled with the quiet despair of a young girl coming to terms with a fractured family. There were hints of arguments, of isolation, of feelings too painful to voice. It was clear that Sarah, despite her outwardly perfect life, had been living in a world of hidden pain. The first entry that truly stood out was dated just a few days before the family's disappearance. In it, Sarah wrote about hearing her parents fight, loudly, destructively, in a way that shook her to the core. The words were filled with quiet desperation, as though Sarah was searching for a way out, searching for something, anything, that could make the noise stop. The diary entries that followed were increasingly haunting, filled with references to fear and confusion. It was as though Sarah knew that something was coming, that her family was unraveling, and that the life she had known was slipping away from her grasp. But there was no entry after the night of the disappearance. The pages went blank. It was as if Sarah's final thoughts had been lost forever, erased by time or by something much darker. The diary didn't just change the course of the investigation. It changed everything. The discovery of the diary was the first real breakthrough in the case. But it also raised more questions than it answered. Why had Sarah written these things down? Had she known something? Had she been trying to send a message? And most chilling of all, had she known what would happen to her family? As the investigation into the Hillside family's disappearance took on new life, the truth began to emerge, slowly and painfully, like a puzzle piece slipping into place. The night the Hillsides disappeared was the beginning of a tragedy that no one could predict it, a mystery that would grow darker, deeper, and more haunting with each new revelation. And yet, it all began on an ordinary evening, an evening when nothing seemed out of the ordinary, when the Hillside family was just another family in a small town. The quiet hum of life was shattered by the sudden, inexplicable absence of a family who had seemed untouchable, invulnerable. What had happened that night? What had caused this tragedy? The answers were hidden in the pages of Sarah's diary, and the story was only just beginning. In the hours after the Hillside family vanished, a wave of confusion swept through the small town. It was as though a heavy fog had descended on their tight-knit community, obscuring what was once clear and familiar. The search for answers began almost immediately, though no one truly understood what they were searching for. The police were called, and the first officers on the scene arrived at the Hillside home, trying to make sense of a situation that defied all logic. The house was locked, but the door was wide open. There was no sign of forced entry, no disturbance inside. It was as if the family had simply walked away, leaving their entire life behind. As the local sheriff and his team stood in the threshold of the Hillside home, they took in the scene with growing uncertainty. The house seemed frozen in time, the stillness almost unnatural. The family's belongings were untouched, as though they had just stepped out for a moment. A half-filled glass of juice sat on the kitchen counter, next to a half-eaten sandwich. Claire's purse lay open on the living room table, her car keys resting beside it. The faint smell of her perfume lingered in the air, but there were no signs of life, no sign of struggle, no indication of where they might have gone. The neighbors, some of whom had been friends with the Hillsides for years, were in a state of shock. They couldn't understand it. What could have happened to them? Was it an accident? Had something terrible befallen the family in the middle of the night? Or was it something else? Something deliberate? The idea that they had simply disappeared, as though they had never existed, seemed impossible. But then, as the hours stretched into day and then the night, that impossible thought began to creep into the minds of everyone who knew the Hillsides. The initial response to the family's sudden disappearance was one of disbelief. They were a well-known, well-liked family. Claire had been active in local charity events, known for her generosity and kindness. Stephen, though a quieter presence, was well respected as a local businessman, a fixture in the town's commercial life. Sarah, the teenage daughter, was a popular figure at her school, known for her charm and bubbly personality. Jamie, though younger, was often seen playing outside with the neighborhood children. The Hillsides were, in many ways, the very definition of suburban perfection. There was no reason to believe that anything was amiss. No signs of financial trouble, no history of violence, no recent arguments or incidents that might have hinted at something darker. But as the search efforts ramped up, the reality of the situation set in. Local authorities began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, speaking with friends and acquaintances, trying to piece together what had happened. No one had seen anything unusual the night before. No strange vehicles, no unfamiliar faces, no signs of a struggle. It was as though the family had simply walked out of their lives without a trace, leaving behind everything they knew and loved. There was no ransom note, no phone calls demanding money or anything else. The case seemed at first like a missing persons report, something that would be resolved in a few days or weeks at most. But as the days wore on, the investigation began to take on an increasingly sinister tone. The sheriff's department reached out to neighboring towns, seeking any information that might help in the search. They extended their efforts to nearby counties, searching the woods, the local river, and even venturing further out, hoping for a breakthrough. It was a sprawling effort, tracking down any lead, no matter how small. Still, nothing surfaced. No bodies, no sign of the Hillsides. No clues, no answers. The case began to grow cold quickly, each passing day adding another layer of uncertainty to an already perplexing situation. As the investigation dragged on, the small town where the Hillsides had lived began to feel the weight of their absence. The streets felt emptier, quieter. People started to look over their shoulders as they walked down the road. They spoke in hushed tones and whispers about the family who had vanished without a trace. Rumors started to circulate. Some suggested that the family had run away, that they had faked their own disappearance for reasons unknown. Others speculated about darker possibilities, that something had happened to them, that there was foul play involved, and that someone in the family or outside of it might know more than they were letting on. There was even talk that the Hillsides had been involved in something criminal, that their disappearance was tied to a secret life they had been living in the shadows. The local media picked up the story, but despite their efforts to uncover more, the truth remained elusive. The town's atmosphere shifted from confusion to fear. The questions continued to mount, but the answers remained just out of reach. With each passing day, the mystery deepened. It wasn't just the disappearance of the Hillsides. It was the fact that there were no signs, no leads, and no clear explanation. The sheriff's office was forced to look at the case from different angles. They questioned everyone close to the family, friends, neighbors, even acquaintances, and everyone seemed to be as in the dark as the authorities. There were no disputes or incidents that anyone could remember, no prior indications of trouble. For a while, it seemed like the investigation was going nowhere. But then, just when it seemed that hope had run out, a breakthrough came, not in the form of a clue or a new witness, but in a simple and seemingly trivial discovery. During a second, more thorough search of the Hillside home, investigators found something that had been overlooked during the first round of investigation. It wasn't much, just a small detail buried in the chaos of the missing persons case. It was a diary, hidden in an old drawer in Sarah's bedroom. At first glance, it seemed like a relic from a teenager's past, filled with innocent musings about school, friends, and boys. It was an ordinary diary, like any other that a girl her age might keep, but there was something different about it, something that had been overlooked in the rush of the investigation, something that would turn out to be the key to understanding the Hillside's disappearance. The diary was handed to the detectives, who had no idea just how important it would become. As they began to read, they quickly realized that it held more than just teenage ramblings. The pages, though initially filled with the typical thoughts of a young girl, her crush on a boy at school, her plans for the weekend, gradually began to shift. The tone darkened. Sarah's entry started to reveal a side of the family that no one had known about, a side that was filled with secrets, with lies, with pain. As the words on the page grew more introspective, it became clear that Sarah had been struggling with her family life in ways that no one had suspected. She had written about the tension between her parents, about arguments that had grown increasingly heated in recent months. She had written about the fear that something was wrong, that the perfect facade of her family was cracking. As Sarah's thoughts and emotions spilled onto the pages of her diary, the detectives found themselves uncovering a hidden world, a world of sorrow and confusion that had been masked by the Hillside's outwardly idyllic existence. The more they read, the more questions began to surface. Was there something more to the family's disappearance than anyone had realized? Had Sarah known something that no one else did? Had she been trying to tell someone, to reveal the truth in the only way she knew how? Through her writing? It was a breakthrough, but it raised more questions than it answered. The discovery of the diary marked the beginning of a new phase in the investigation. It was a phase that would force everyone to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Hillside family, about their lives, and about the mystery that had captivated an entire town. And yet, for all the questions it raised, the discovery of the diary also marked a turning point. It was the first clue that the Hillsides had not simply disappeared into thin air, that they had not simply walked away from their lives. There was something more, something deeper, something hidden in the shadows of their lives. And the diary, it seemed, held the key to unlocking it. The search for the truth was far from over, but now there was a path to follow, a trail to trace. And though it would take months, perhaps even years, before the full story would be understood, the discovery of Sarah's diary had set the stage for a new chapter in the investigation. The question that remained was whether the answers it held would bring closure, or only deepen the mystery even further. The discovery of Sarah's diary was like finding a small crack in a wall that had previously seemed impenetrable. Initially dismissed as a trivial artifact of a teenager's life, it soon revealed itself to be a window into something far darker and more complex. What seemed at first like harmless musings about boys, friends, and school quickly turned into an unsettling portrait of family in turmoil. The pages, once filled with innocent teenage thoughts, began to unravel the secrets that Sarah had so carefully hidden, laying bare the struggles she had silently endured for years. Sarah's handwriting was neat, precise, the words flowing in a rhythm that felt almost detached. The early entries were typical of a young girl navigating the trials of adolescence. Her crushes, her plans for the future, her hopes for a life beyond the confines of her small town. There was something almost nostalgic about the simplicity of those first few pages, an innocence that felt out of place in the context of the mystery that had unfolded. But it was the subtle undercurrents within those early pages that, upon closer inspection, hinted at a more complicated reality. There was mention of small arguments between her parents, fleeting references to a bad day or a rough patch at home, but these were often followed by lines that seemed to brush aside the discomfort, as if Sarah herself were trying to convince herself that things were fine, that everything would be okay. It was as though she were writing for an audience, someone or something that could give her the comfort she so desperately needed. But as the pages turned, the tone of the diary began to shift, as though the tension in Sarah's life could no longer be masked by the facade of normalcy she had tried to uphold. In one entry, she wrote about a fight she had overheard between her parents, a fight that seemed far more intense than the one she had written about before. It was strange, she admitted, to hear them yell like that. They had always seemed so perfect, so untouchable. Her mother, Claire, who had always been a picture of warmth and kindness, and her father, Stephen, who was quiet but steady, always reliable. These were the people Sarah had known her whole life. But this time, the fight felt different. There were words exchanged that Sarah couldn't understand, words that sounded harsh, venomous, as though they were being said not just in anger but in pain. She didn't go into the specifics of the argument, but there was a clear sense of fear in the way she described it. She spoke about her mother's voice trembling, about her father's cold silence. Sarah wrote that she had wanted to intervene, to say something, but instead she had stayed in her room, pretending to read, pretending that nothing was happening. It was the first crack in the family's perfect image, a moment that would become increasingly important as the mystery deepened. For the first time, Sarah was acknowledging that her home, her family, wasn't as perfect as it seemed on the outside, and this realization, as subtle as it was, would set the stage for the darker revelations that followed. The entries that came after this first fight revealed a deepening sense of confusion and fear in Sarah's heart. She began to write more frequently, her words growing more introspective, more reflective. She spoke about how her parents had started to pull away from each other, how the distance between them seemed to widen each day. At first, it was small things. Her father spending more time in the office, her mother becoming increasingly quiet at dinner. But as time went on, the cracks in their relationship became more pronounced. Sarah's observations were keen, her insights sharp. She could see the way her mother would look at her father, her face filled with a kind of sadness that Sarah didn't know how to interpret. She could hear the way her father's voice would grow tense, his words clipped when her mother would speak. The house, once filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation, had grown silent in a way that unsettled her. One entry in particular stood out, dated just a few days before the family's disappearance. In it, Sarah described a fight between her parents that had escalated into something far worse than any of the others. This argument had been different. It had felt dangerous. The words exchanged between her mother and father were sharp, cutting, and Sarah could hear the strain in their voices. There was something in the air that night that she couldn't quite place. She described a sense of impending doom, a feeling that something terrible was on the verge of happening. And she wrote about her own fear of what the next day would bring. She spoke of a gnawing feeling in her gut, a sense that her family was falling apart in ways she could not stop. The diary entry ended with the words, "I don't know what's going to happen, but I think something is coming, something bad." Reading this, the investigators were struck by the eerie foresight in Sarah's words. It was as though she had known, even then, that her family was on the brink of something irreversible. They could sense the weight of her fear, the desperation that seemed to seep through the ink of the page. But what made it all the more chilling was the way she had written it down, almost as though she were trying to make sense of her own confusion, trying to process a reality that she didn't fully understand. The finality of her words, the way she acknowledged the inevitability of what was happening, hinted at a knowledge of her situation that no one else had. For the investigators, this was a crucial turning point. It was no longer just a missing persons case. It was a story of family unraveling, of a young girl caught in the middle of something much larger than she could comprehend. The diary began to take on a new significance. It wasn't just a teenage girl's musings. It was a record of the disintegration of family, a map of the emotional landscape that Sarah had lived through, a trail of breadcrumbs leading to the heart of the mystery. What made the diary even more poignant was the fact that Sarah had never shared it with anyone, not with her friends, not with her teachers, and certainly not with her parents. It was her secret, a place where she could pour out her fears and frustrations without anyone knowing. In many ways, it was her only escape. The more the investigators read, the more they began to understand just how isolated Sarah had felt. She had been alone in her struggle, holding on to a family that seemed to be falling apart, unable to do anything to stop it. As the diary progressed, the entries grew darker, more disturbing. Sarah wrote about her increasing sense of powerlessness, about the growing tension between her parents, and about her fear for her own safety. In one particularly troubling entry, she wrote about overhearing another argument, this time between her father and a mysterious person on the phone. She didn't know who the person was, but the conversation was intense. Her father's voice, usually calm and controlled, had been shaking with anger. Sarah couldn't make out the words, but the tone of the conversation was enough to make her feel uneasy. She described how her father had slammed the phone down, his face pale, his eyes wild with frustration. It was clear that the family's problems went deeper than just a simple disagreement. There was something more going on beneath the surface, something that no one had seen, and it was becoming increasingly apparent that Sarah knew more than she was letting on, even though she had never fully expressed her suspicions. The diary, once a simple collection of adolescent thoughts, was now a haunting record of a young girl's awareness of the turmoil around her. By the time the final entries were written, the tension in Sarah's writing was palpable. She spoke about the fear she felt in her own home, about the weight of the secrets that had been kept from her. There were mentions of late-night phone calls, of unexplained absences, of things her parents were hiding. But just as quickly as it had all begun to unfold, the diary ended. The last entry was dated only a day or two before the family disappeared, and it was fragmented, almost as if Sarah had been interrupted mid-thought. She had written, "I don't know how much longer I can do this. And then there was nothing. The page was blank. The finality of that last entry, the sense of an abrupt and unexplained end, was chilling. It was as though Sarah had known something was about to happen, something she couldn't control. And in that silence, in the absence of her words, the investigators were left with the unnerving feeling that they might never know what had really happened to the Hillside family. As they closed the diary and placed it in evidence, they knew one thing for certain. The truth was buried in the pages, hidden in Sarah's words, and the journey to uncover that truth was only just beginning. The deeper the investigators delved into Sarah's diary, the more it became clear that the family's life was far from the idyllic picture they had once believed it to be. In the beginning, the entries read like those of any typical teenager, full of the highs and lows of adolescence. Sarah's world seemed to revolve around school, friends, crushes, and the usual teenage worries. But as the days turned into months and the diary entries became more frequent, it was impossible to ignore the darkness that began to seep into the pages. Behind the facade of normalcy, there were cracks, deep, wide cracks that Sarah had been documenting in the only way she knew how. Sarah had always been perceptive, a quiet observer of the world around her, and as her diary evolved, it became apparent that she had seen much more than anyone had realized. It wasn't just the occasional argument between her parents or the moments of tension she had once brushed off. It was the little details, the things no one else had noticed, that painted a picture of a family in decline. As the entries grew more honest, Sarah began to open up about her feelings of isolation and fear. At first, Sarah had been careful, tentative even, about revealing the extent of the strain she felt in her home. The references to her parents' increasing distance from each other had been subtle, small moments she would later revisit with more clarity, more depth. She wrote about the way her mother's laughter, once so loud and full of life, had started to sound hollow. There was a sharp edge to her voice, a weariness that hadn't been there before. Claire, once the embodiment of maternal warmth, was slowly retreating into herself. Sarah began to notice the way her mother would lose herself in thought, staring out the window for hours, as if lost in a world that didn't quite fit her anymore. The joy that had defined Claire's personality seemed to fade with every passing day, and Sarah was helpless to do anything about it. Then there was Stephen, her father. He had always been a quieter presence, but lately his mood seemed unpredictable. There were times when he would come home from work and retreat to his study not emerging for hours. Other times, he would be uncharacteristically distant, his gaze drifting past Sarah as if she were a stranger. Sarah recalled feeling the tension in the air when they were all together, how conversations would stall abruptly, the air thick with words left unsaid. She was too young to understand everything, but she knew enough to feel the discomfort. It was like walking into a room where everyone was talking, but no one was speaking the truth. Her parents weren't just arguing. They were withdrawing from each other, from her, from the life they had once built. Sarah's fear grew as the months passed. Her diary began to shift from observations about her parents' relationship to deeper reflections about her own feelings of displacement and confusion. There were moments when she wrote about the growing sense of alienation, how she felt like she was living in a house with people she didn't recognize. The family that had once felt like a safe harbor was now a place of uncertainty. Sarah began to question everything: their love, their stability, their future. It was as if she were watching the dissolution of her world from the outside, powerless to stop it, unable to fully comprehend why it was happening or how it could be fixed. The entries became more desperate. Sarah wrote about trying to hold on to the fragments of normalcy, even as the foundation beneath her cracked. She clung to the things that had once brought her comfort: her schoolwork, her friendships, her dreams of escaping the small town. But these things seemed so distant now. She began to feel as if she were trapped, caught between the need for stability and the growing realization that things at home would never be the same. The voice that had once been carefree and hopeful now sounded weary, resigned. In one entry, Sarah confessed her fear that things were beyond repair. Her parents, she wrote, were too far gone. She had watched them slowly destroy each other, watched them wither away inside the walls of their own home. Sarah wrote of feeling invisible, as if no one could see her pain, as if she were alone in her struggle. She described the haunting silence that had overtaken the house, how her father's anger, once confined to quiet frustrations, had begun to seep into every conversation, every glance. It wasn't just that they were drifting apart. They were pulling away from her, too. The love that had once surrounded her felt like a distant memory. The fear she felt was not just for her parents, but for herself. Who was she in a family that was breaking apart? The emotional weight of Sarah's words was overwhelming. In her own way, she was trying to make sense of her crumbling world, but each entry seemed to suggest a realization she couldn't escape. The life she had known was slipping away. There was no answer, no solution, only an aching sense of inevitability. She began to question whether her family was even capable of love anymore, whether the ties that once bound them had become so frayed they could never be repaired. The cracks in her family's foundation were becoming more and more apparent. In the weeks before the Hillside's disappearance, Sarah's writing took on a darker, more reflective tone. She began to express a profound sadness that seemed to weigh down each word. She wrote about the endless cycles of hope and disappointment, about the longing for something she couldn't name. In the space between the lines, there was an ever-present undercurrent of fear. Fear of what might happen next, fear of what might become of her family, and ultimately, fear of what might become of her. It was clear that she was struggling not just with the dissolution of her family, but with the larger question of her place in the world. But it wasn't just her family life that seemed to be in turmoil. Sarah's relationship with her peers began to unravel as well. As her parents' marriage crumbled, Sarah became increasingly isolated from her friends, who didn't understand what she was going through. Her peers, preoccupied with their own adolescent dramas, were oblivious to the storm raging inside her home. Sarah didn't know how to explain the suffocating silence, the sense of being invisible to anyone who might listen. She couldn't explain the fear that kept her awake at night, or the sadness that crept into her heart every time she saw her parents avoid each other's gaze. She didn't know how to tell them that her family was falling apart in ways no one could see, that the perfect image of their lives was a lie. The entries that followed grew more intense. Sarah's isolation deepened as the emotional divide between her parents widened. She wrote about her father's increasing mood swings, how he would sometimes snap at her for no reason at all, his frustration spilling over in a way that scared her. She described her mother's silence, how Claire had become distant, retreating into herself as though she were living in another world entirely. In one of her final entries, Sarah wrote about a conversation she overheard between her parents. They were arguing again, but this time, The words were more cutting, more accusatory. Her mother's voice trembled, and Sarah could hear her father's anger rising, like a storm threatening to break. The argument, though brief, left Sarah feeling as though the foundation of her world had shifted once again. The unease she had been feeling for months now felt like a tangible thing, something she could reach out and touch. And then there were the last few entries, the entries that would haunt the investigators for years to come. They were written in a rush, the words scrawled across the page in a frantic hand. Sarah's writing became more fragmented, as though she were struggling to keep up with the whirlwind of thoughts that raced through her mind. In her final entry, she wrote about the feeling that something was coming, something terrible. She didn't know what it was, but she could sense it. It was as though a storm was gathering on the horizon, and she was powerless to stop it. Her final words, scribbled hastily, were, "I can't escape it. I can't fix it. And I don't know if I even want it anymore." The diary ended abruptly, as if Sarah had been interrupted in the middle of writing. The sudden silence was deafening. The last words she had written seemed to echo in the minds of those who read them, a haunting premonition of what was to come. It was as though Sarah had known, deep down, that something irreversible was about to happen, something that would change everything. But what that was, no one knew. The page remained blank, the final thoughts of a frightened girl lost to time. Sarah's diary had become a powerful testament to the pain she had lived with, a window into the psychological and emotional turmoil that unfolded within the walls of the Hillside home. And as the investigation into their disappearance deepened, it became clear that the answers to the family's tragic fate were buried within those pages. But the mystery of what happened that night, the night they all disappeared, remained unresolved. Would Sarah's words provide the key to unlocking the truth, or would they only deepen the mystery, leaving more questions than answers? The journey to find out had only just begun. The discovery of Sarah's diary had provided the first real insight into the emotional landscape of the Hillside family, but had done little to unravel the mystery of their disappearance. The unsettling entries, filled with fear, confusion, and a growing sense of doom, paint a picture of family on the brink of collapse. Yet, the deeper the investigators dug into Sarah's words, the more questions arose. The diary had opened a door, but it had also closed off many others, leaving behind a sense of haunting uncertainty. What had happened that night? What had driven this seemingly perfect family to vanish without a trace? As the weeks stretched on and the investigation grew colder, the search for answers became more intense. Law enforcement expanded their search efforts, reaching out to neighboring states and even other countries, hoping for a breakthrough. But nothing came. No signs, no clues, no new leads. The family's disappearance continued to baffle the authorities, and the town itself had begun to feel the weight of the mystery pressing in on them. They were no closer to understanding the truth than they had been on the first day the Hillsides had vanished. It was as though the family had simply evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions. Despite the apparent dead end in the investigation, there was one thing the authorities could not ignore: the sense of dread that hung over the town like a thick fog. People spoke of it in whispers, afraid to acknowledge what they had begun to suspect: that the Hillsides had not just disappeared, but had been swallowed whole by something darker, something beyond their understanding. The mystery surrounding their vanishing had started to consume the collective consciousness of the community. People began to wonder if they had missed something, if there had been signs all along, signs that could have warned them of what was coming. Could they have prevented it? Could they have stopped whatever had driven the Hillsides to disappear? Rumors circulated. Stories began to take on lives of their own. Some believed the Hillsides had run away, fleeing from some unknown, deep-seated problem within their family. Others whispered about foul play, about the possibility that someone in the town had been involved in their disappearance. Theories about the family's secret lives began to gain traction. Maybe Sarah had known more than she had written in her diary. Some suggested maybe she had been hiding something, keeping something for her family. But as the investigation wore on, these theories began to feel like little more than smoke and mirrors. Shadows danced in the minds of those desperate for an explanation. The pressure to solve the case grew, especially as more time passed without answers. The town, once peaceful and content, was now consumed by the haunting memory of the Hillside family's disappearance. People went on with their daily lives, but there was always a sense that something was wrong. Something was missing. The empty house on the corner became a silent symbol of the tragedy that had rocked their quiet town. It was a reminder of what had been lost and a constant question mark, taunting those who still believed that somewhere, somehow, the truth would emerge. Then, nearly a year after the Hillsides had vanished, an unexpected breakthrough came. It arrived not in the form of new evidence, but through an anonymous tip. The tipster, who claimed to know something about the Hillsides' disappearance, reached out to the local sheriff's department. The message was cryptic, suggesting that the family's disappearance was linked to a series of events that had been taking place in the town long before their disappearance. The tipster spoke of a hidden connection between the Hillsides and a group that had been active in the area, an underground circle operating just beneath the surface of everyday life. The tip didn't reveal much, but it was enough to reignite the flames of curiosity in the investigators. The authorities took the tip seriously, but without any solid leads to pursue, they were forced to go back to the beginning. They re-examined the details of the case. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every moment that might hold a clue. They revisited the Hillside's friends and family, searching for anyone who might have known something about the family's troubled dynamics or their possible connections to the underground group. But no one had any concrete answers. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had any idea who the tipster might be, and no one seemed to have any further information about the mysterious group that had been suggested. The investigators began to feel as though they were chasing shadows. With each new lead, they found themselves returning to the same starting point. The Hillside were gone, and no one knew why. The sense of helplessness began to weigh heavily on the team. They were no closer to the truth than they had been months ago. But just when it seemed like the investigation might stall once again, a new angle emerged, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about the family's disappearance. The breakthrough came when an old, long-forgotten acquaintance of the Hillsides was located, someone who had once been close to the family, but who had fallen out of contact years before the disappearance. This individual, a former business partner of Stephen Hillside's, had once been a trusted friend of the family. But according to sources, the relationship had soured after a business deal had gone awry. The former business partner, now living in another state, had no idea that the Hillsides had vanished, but when he was contacted, he claimed to have information that could shed light on the case. He spoke with the authorities, and his revelations would prove to be a key turning point in the investigation. The former business partner claimed that, in the months leading up to their disappearance, Stephen Hillside had been involved in some questionable financial dealings. It seemed that Stephen had become entangled in a series of risky investments and had found himself in over his head. The business partner revealed that Stephen had been acting strangely in the months before he and his family vanished. He was constantly anxious, often distracted, and seemed to be hiding something. The business partner believed that Stephen had been dealing with someone shady, someone who had been pressuring him into making decisions he wasn't comfortable with. The partner didn't know who these people were, but he suspected that they had something to do with the Hillside's disappearance. As the investigators followed this lead, they uncovered a web of financial transactions that painted a far different picture of the Hillsides than anyone had imagined. It turned out that Stephen had been involved in a series of secretive and high-risk investments, some of which had been linked to a shadowy group that operated on the fringes of the town's economy. The group, whose name was not immediately clear, seemed to have been using local businesses to launder money. It appeared that Stephen had become one of their unwilling players. His involvement with this group had escalated over time, but he had kept it hidden from everyone, including his wife, Claire. This new revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The possibility that the Hillside's disappearance had been the result of some sort of financial conspiracy began to seem more likely. The group that had been pressuring Stephen was now seen as the prime suspect. It became clear that, in their desperation, the Hillsides had gotten caught up in something far darker than anyone had realized. Their perfect family facade had been nothing more than a mask. Beneath it lay a world of secrecy, betrayal, and danger. But as the authorities dug deeper into Stephen's dealings, they found that the connection to the shadowy group went beyond just financial struggles. There were hints of something more, a deeper, more sinister connection that had yet to be fully uncovered. Some believed that Stephen had been planning to expose a group that had been gathering evidence to bring them down. And that, perhaps, was why the group had acted with such force, why they had made the hillsides disappear. The more the investigators uncovered, the more it seemed like the family's vanishing was no accident. It was no longer just a mystery. It was a carefully orchestrated act, driven by motives far beyond anything the town had initially imagined. In the midst of this revelation, the investigators began to piece together a picture of the final days of the Hillside family's life. The arguments, the isolation, the growing tension. They were all part of a larger narrative that had unfolded in the shadows. Sarah's diary had hinted at the unraveling of the family's bonds, but had been only a small part of the larger story. The discovery of Stephen's involvement with the underground group was the piece of the puzzle that had been missing, the key that unlocked the door to the truth. But as the investigation pressed on, there were still many questions left unanswered. Who were the people behind the group? What did they want from Stephen? And, perhaps most importantly, why had they chosen to make the hillsides disappear? The answers to these questions seemed just out of reach, buried somewhere in the complex web of secrecy and deceit that had surrounded the family. The deeper the investigators dug, the more it seemed like the truth would always be just beyond their grasp. And so, the mystery of the Hillside family's disappearance continued to haunt the town, a tragedy shrouded in darkness, with no clear resolution in sight. The family had vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions. But the answers, it seemed, were hidden in the shadows. And whether the investigators could find them, or whether the truth would remain lost forever, remained to be seen. As the investigation into the disappearance of the Hillside family deepened, the puzzle became increasingly complex, shrouded in layers of secrecy and deceit that made it nearly impossible to discern where the truth truly lay. The financial revelations that had come to light about Stephen Hillside's involvement with his shadowy underground group had cast a dark cloud over the family's seemingly perfect life. The more the authorities learned, the more the initial assumptions about the family's disappearance began to feel naive. This was not simply the story of a family vanishing from their home. It was the story of a man who had been ensnared in a dangerous web of financial intrigue and criminal activity. Yet, even as new leads emerged and more questions were raised, the central question remained. Why did the hillsides disappear? Was it a desperate escape, a betrayal, or something even darker? The financial transactions that linked Stephen Hillside to this group were more intricate than anyone had imagined. At first, investigators had assumed that Stephen was simply a victim of poor judgment, a man who had taken on more risk than he could handle and got entangled in a web of deceit. But the more they uncovered, the more it became clear that there was much more to the story. The group that had been pressuring Stephen wasn't just a business entity or a collection of criminals looking to make a quick profit. They were a network that had been operating for years, their influence reaching far beyond the confines of the small town where the hillsides had lived. They were a shadowy organization, one that had established roots in a variety of local businesses, manipulating financial systems and laundering money in ways that no one had noticed until it was too late. The investigators had stumbled upon a financial trail that led back years before the hillsides had gone missing. Stephen had been making transactions to and from accounts that were linked to this underground network, and the more they traced the money, the more it became clear that Stephen had been operating on a much larger scale than anyone had suspected. He had been involved in a series of investments and deals that, at first glance, seemed legitimate. Business ventures that appeared to be part of a man trying to secure a future for his family. But as the investigators began to pull back the layers, they found evidence of hidden debts, shady dealings, and a complicated web of financial pressure that Stephen had been unable to escape. What had initially seemed like a family man's desperate attempt to provide for his loved ones had, in reality, been a man caught in a trap, unable to break free from the financial forces that surrounded him. Stephen had tried to shield his family from the reality of his troubles, but the more they uncovered, the more it seemed like his attempts had been futile. The pressure was mounting, not just in the underground group, but from other business interests that were beginning to circle like vultures, ready to take advantage of his weakened position. It became apparent that Stephen's life was spiraling out of control long before the family disappeared. His quiet demeanor, which had once seemed so dependable, now seemed like a mask for a man struggling with deep, internal turmoil. But what no one had been able to fully grasp until now was the emotional toll this pressure had taken on Stephen. His family had been caught in the crossfire, unwittingly dragged into a world they had no part in. Claire, his wife, had no idea just how deep the rabbit hole went. She had known that something was off, that Stephen was not the man he once was, but she had no way of understanding the full scope of his involvement with these dangerous figures. The arguments that had erupted in their home, the silent treatments, the long hours spent in his study. These were all signs of man unraveling, but they were also symptoms of a larger problem. Claire had sensed the tension, but like Sarah, she was powerless to stop it. She had no idea how to reach him, how to pull him back from the brink. The emotional distance between them had only deepened as Stephen became more entrenched in this dangerous world. As the weight of his financial troubles grew heavier, so did his sense of isolation. It seemed that Stephen had begun to believe that there was no way out, no way to fix what had gone wrong. The feelings of hopelessness and despair had taken root in him, and they began to spread to those around him. It was clear that in his mind, he had already failed his family. He had gotten them caught up in a situation from which there was no escape. The more they investigated, the more it became apparent that Stephen's sense of powerlessness had reached a breaking point. He had tried to protect his family, but in the end, he had failed them in ways they could never have understood. The investigators began to dig into Stephen's emotional and psychological state, piecing together a picture of a man who had grown increasingly paranoid and withdrawn in the months leading up to the family's disappearance. He had been under constant pressure from the underground group, but he had also been battling a sense of guilt and shame for what he had dragged his family into. The man who had once been seen as a pillar of the community, a quiet but reliable businessman, was now a man struggling to keep his world from collapsing entirely. His actions in the weeks before the disappearance began to take on new significance. His late nights at the office, his avoidance of his family, his silence. These were not just signs of a man who was stressed, but of someone who was preparing for something. Whether he knew it or not, Stephen was preparing for the inevitable fallout. Then came the disturbing reports from people who had interacted with Stephen in those final weeks. Some described his behavior as erratic, others as detached. There were rumors that Stephen had been meeting with mysterious figures in dark corners of town, shaking hands with people whose identities he never revealed. His business dealings had taken on an air of secrecy, and those close to him noted that he had become obsessed with one particular project, one that he refused to discuss even with his wife. There were whispers of a deal being made, something big, something that Stephen had to see through to the end, no matter the cost. It seemed that this deal had consumed him, had clouded his judgment, and driven him further into isolation. He was no longer the man he had once been. The pressure had transformed him into someone else, someone unrecognizable. In the days leading up to the disappearance, Stephen's behavior had reached a fever pitch. The last few conversations he had with Claire were strained, distant. There were no real arguments in those final days, nothing that would suggest that something violent had occurred. But there was something in the air, something unspoken. Claire had become aware of the weight on Stephen's shoulders, the fact that he was fighting some internal battle that she couldn't begin to understand. She had tried to talk to him, but he had become distant, closed off. There was a sense of finality in their last interactions, as though Stephen had already made up his mind about something he couldn't share with her. And then, just before they disappeared, Stephen had gone out one last time, telling Claire and Sarah that he needed to meet with someone. He didn't say who, and he didn't say where. He simply left, disappearing into the night, leaving his family behind. It was the last time anyone saw him. The police later learned that Stephen had been meeting with someone connected to the underground group, someone who had been pressuring him for months. What transpired during that meeting was unclear, but it was evident that Stephen had reached the end of his rope. The investigators suspected that this final meeting had something to do with the family's disappearance, but they were still left to piece together the details. It was as if Stephen's decision, whatever it had been, had set in motion a chain of events that no one could have predicted. As the authorities continued to investigate, they began to uncover even more chilling details. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, a former associate of the underground group. This individual, once a member of the network, had left the group years ago and was living under an alias in another part of the country. When he heard about the Hillside family's disappearance, something clicked. He reached out to the authorities, providing them with a name, a person at the heart of the group, someone who had been controlling the operation from behind the scenes. This person, whose identity was unknown, had been pulling the strings in Stephen's life for months, manipulating him, forcing him into situations he couldn't escape. The former associate explained that Stephen's disappearance was not an accident. It was a result of a deliberate, calculated move by this powerful figure, someone who had been using Stephen for their own gain. This revelation changed everything. The disappearance of the Hillsides was no longer just a financial disaster gone wrong. It was part of something far larger, a conspiracy that spanned years and reached far beyond the small town where the Hillsides had lived. It was a story of manipulation, coercion, and power, one that involved a network of dangerous individuals willing to do anything to protect their interests. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the mystery was far from over. The truth, it seemed, was even darker than anyone had imagined. The deeper the investigation went, the more it seemed that the Hillsides had been caught in the middle of something much larger than themselves, something that had consumed their lives, their family, and ultimately their fate. And though the authorities were getting closer to understanding what had really happened to the Hillside family, the answers they sought remained elusive, hidden within a maze of lies, corruption, and fear. The mystery was far from over, and the truth was still waiting to be uncovered. The investigation into the Hillside family's disappearance had reached a critical point, but the more the authorities unraveled, the more convoluted the case became. Despite the growing web of connections, the identity of the shadowy figures involved in the family's fate remained elusive. Each discovery raised new questions, and each lead seemed to only deepen the mystery. As the investigation pressed on, it became clear that the Hillsides had not merely vanished into thin air. They had been swallowed by something far darker, something far more dangerous than anyone had initially imagined. The more the authorities learned, the clearer it became that the family's disappearance was no random event. It was a culmination of months, perhaps even years, of calculated manipulation and hidden agendas. Sarah's diary had given the investigators their first glimpse into the emotional landscape of the Hillside family, a glimpse that revealed a family on the brink of collapse, desperately trying to maintain a facade of normalcy. The discovery of Stephen's involvement with the underground group had further illuminated the pressure he had been under, the guilt that weighed heavily on his shoulders, and the paranoia that had consumed him in the weeks leading up to the family's disappearance. But even as they pieced together Stephen's troubled financial dealings, the authorities were still left with an unsettling question. Why had the family been targeted? What had made them so important to the dangerous individuals who had seemingly orchestrated their disappearance? The more the investigators delved into the dark underbelly of the financial network that had ensnared Stephen, the more they realized that the Hillsides had been just one of many families caught in its grip. The group that had been pulling the strings was far-reaching and insidious, with ties to businesses, banks, and individuals in positions of power. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. The underground network had been manipulating local economies, distorting the financial systems, and using families like the Hillsides to further their own hidden agendas. The group was an invisible force, one that operated in the shadows, moving quietly through communities, infiltrating businesses, and quietly shaping the lives of those who were unwittingly involved in their operations. As investigators continued to dig, they learned that Stephen Hillside had been far more than just an innocent bystander in this operation. He had become a pawn in a much larger game. It turned out that he had been specifically chosen by the group for his position in the community. Stephen was a man who was respected, well-liked, and seen as a stable figure. He had built a reputation as a hard-working businessman, a reliable family man. His family, too, had a reputation for being close-knit and picture-perfect. But in the eyes of the underground network, this was exactly why he had been selected. They needed someone who would blend in, someone whose involvement would not raise suspicion. And so, Stephen had been drawn into their web, seemingly by accident. But as time passed, the stakes grew higher, and Stephen found himself trapped in a situation he could no longer control. The network that had ensnared him was ruthless in its methods. They had pressured Stephen into making increasingly risky business decisions, each one leading him deeper into debt and further away from his family. It became clear that Stephen had not just been making poor decisions. He had been manipulated, coerced, and, in many ways, controlled. The authorities learned that the underground group had threatened Stephen's family, using his love for them as leverage. The more he tried to extricate himself from their grasp, the more they tightened their hold. The threats against his family had escalated over time, and Stephen had reached a point where he felt there was no way out. It was a trap from which there was no escape. An emotional toll it had taken on him was evident in the months leading up to the disappearance. As the pressure mounted, Stephen had begun to distance himself from his family, unable to share the burden he carried. His wife, Claire, had sensed that something was wrong but had been unable to understand the full scope of the situation. The tension in their marriage had grown unbearable, but she had no way of knowing what was truly at the heart of it. It seemed that Stephen's desperation had reached a breaking point in the final days before their disappearance. The last interactions he had with Claire were distant and strained, and there was a sense of finality to them, as though Stephen had made a decision that no one could reverse. In the weeks before the disappearance, Stephen had been in contact with people from the underground group, trying to make sense of his options. He had spoken to several individuals, trying to negotiate a way out of the situation, but it was clear that the group had no intention of letting him go. The more he tried to extricate himself, the more dangerous the situation became. He was cornered, his every move watched, his every decision scrutinized. It was at this point that the group had made their intentions clear. They were not going to allow Stephen to leave, at least not without a price. The authorities were able to piece together the last few hours of Stephen's life. According to sources, he had made one final attempt to break free from the group, contacting an individual he had once trusted, hoping to secure a way out. The meeting had been arranged in secret, and it was here that the investigators uncovered a chilling piece of the puzzle. Stephen had been planning to expose the underground group, to bring their illicit operations to light. He had gathered evidence, documents, and recordings that could have potentially unraveled the entire network. But it seemed that Stephen had underestimated the reach and power of those he was dealing with. The final meeting took place in a nondescript location on the outskirts of town. Stephen, desperate for a solution, had hoped that this last-ditch effort would free him from the grip of the underground network. He had arrived at the meeting place, prepared to share what he knew and to expose the group for the criminals they were. But when he walked into that room, he was met not with an ally, but with an enemy. The group had known all along what Stephen was planning, and they had used his desperation against him. It was a trap. Stephen had walked into a carefully orchestrated ambush, and before he could even attempt to defend himself, he was confronted by the figures who had been pulling the strings all along. The investigators later learned that Stephen had been taken from that meeting and never seen again. His final attempt to expose the underground group had failed. The authorities could not determine whether he had been killed outright or whether he had simply been forced into hiding. Either way, it was clear that the group had silenced him, ensuring that he would never speak out about their operations. As for his family, it seemed that they had been caught in the crossfire. The authorities believed that Stephen's disappearance had triggered a chain reaction, one that led to the abduction of his wife and daughter. The family had not simply disappeared. They had been taken, hidden away by those who had been manipulating Stephen for so long. As the investigation continued, the authorities struggled to piece together the details of what had happened in the hours and days following Stephen's disappearance. There were reports of strange movements around the Hillside family's home. People seen leaving the area in the middle of the night, vehicles that had been parked nearby with no clear explanation. The more the authorities dug, the more it became clear that the family's vanishing had been meticulously planned. It was not a random act, nor was it the result of a sudden, spontaneous decision. It had been carefully orchestrated, with every move calculated to avoid detection. The Hillsides had been taken by a powerful group, one that had the resources and the influence to cover their tracks and keep their operation hidden from the world. In the wake of these revelations, the investigators faced an even more unsettling question. Why had the group chosen to take the entire family? Why had they not simply eliminated Stephen and left the rest of the family behind? As the investigation continued, the authorities began to suspect that the disappearance of the Hillsides was not just about silencing Stephen. It was about sending a message. The underground network had no qualms about using fear and intimidation to control their victims, and the disappearance of the Hillside family was the ultimate demonstration of their power. By taking the family, they had sent a clear signal. No one was safe, not even the most respected members of the community. The group was untouchable, its influence reaching into every corner of the town, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Despite the growing body of evidence and the many leads that had emerged, the fate of the Hillside family remained unknown. They had vanished without a trace, and the investigators were left with little more than a collection of fragments. Sarah's diary, Stephen's financial records, and the testimony of those who had known them. The more they uncovered, the more it became apparent that the Hillside family had been caught in a world far darker than anyone had imagined. They had been pawns in a much larger game, one that involved manipulation, coercion, and violence. And as the investigation continued, it became clear that the true extent of the underground network's power and reach was still unknown. In the end, the disappearance of the Hillside family was not just a story of a family's tragic fate. It was a story of a small community torn apart by forces beyond its control, a story of manipulation, betrayal, and secrecy. And as the authorities closed in on the truth, the haunting question remained: would they ever find the Hillsides? Or had they become just another casualty in the endless struggle for power and control that lay hidden beneath the surface of their quiet town? The mystery was far from over, and the answers, it seemed, were still locked away in the shadows. The deeper the investigators dug into the tangled web surrounding the Hillside family's disappearance, the more they began to understand that they weren't just dealing with a simple case of a vanished family. They were confronting something much larger, something insidious that had been lurking beneath the surface of the town for years. Every lead they chased, every discovery they made, seemed to reveal only more layers of the conspiracy, more evidence that the family's fate had been sealed by powerful forces whose motivations were far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The underground network, whose tentacles reached far deeper into the community than anyone had known, seemed to be the key to understanding the Hillside's tragic end. It wasn't just about financial manipulation or criminal activities. It was about control, secrecy, and the ruthless drive to maintain power. What had initially appeared to be a random series of financial mistakes and poor decisions on Stephen's part now seemed to be part of a carefully calculated plan by those who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. The authorities had learned that Stephen's involvement with the network was not just a product of bad luck. It had been orchestrated from the beginning. The people who had targeted him had known exactly what they were doing. They had used his own fears and vulnerabilities against him, slowly tightened their grip on him until he had no choice but to comply with their demands.